Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Sarah Thompson, and joining me today is Michael Chen.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic.
That's right, Michael. Today we're discussing a fascinating and complex legal case from India that touches on issues of crime, punishment, and the death penalty. This case, known as Ediga Anamma vs. State of Andhra Pradesh, was decided by the Supreme Court of India in 1974.
It's quite a gripping case, Sarah. Before we get into the details, can you give our listeners some context about the Indian legal system?
Certainly. India's legal system is based on common law, similar to the UK and US. The Supreme Court of India is the highest court in the country, and its decisions are binding on all lower courts. This particular case dealt with a murder conviction and the appropriateness of the death penalty.
That's helpful context. Now let's dive into the specifics of this case. What were the basic facts?
The case revolves around a young woman named Ediga Anamma, who was convicted of murdering another woman named Ansuya and Ansuya's young child. The murders took place in a rural area of Andhra Pradesh, a state in southern India.
That sounds horrific. What was the motive behind these murders?
The motive appears to have been jealousy. Both Anamma and Ansuya were involved in extramarital affairs with the same man, identified as PW16 in the court documents. Anamma became jealous when she discovered that PW16 was also involved with Ansuya.
I see. So this was essentially a crime of passion?
In a sense, yes. But it's important to note that the court found the murder to be premeditated and cleverly planned. Anamma lured Ansuya and her child to a field, where she killed them both. She then attempted to cover up her crime by burning Ansuya's face to make identification difficult and dressing the body in her own clothes to mislead investigators.
That's quite elaborate. How was Anamma eventually caught?
The cover-up actually backfired. Initially, people thought Anamma herself had been murdered because of the clothing on the body. But when Anamma turned up alive, suspicion quickly turned to her. She eventually confessed to PW16, and physical evidence linked her to the crime.
This case seems to have a lot of twists and turns. What happened in the legal proceedings?
Anamma was tried and convicted of murder. The trial court sentenced her to death, and this sentence was upheld by the High Court. The case then went to the Supreme Court of India on appeal.
And what did the Supreme Court decide?
This is where the case gets really interesting from a legal perspective. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction, but changed the sentence from death to life imprisonment.
That's a significant change. What factors did the court consider in making this decision?
The court looked at a number of factors. They considered Anamma's personal circumstances. She was a young woman of 24, had been forced out of her husband's home, and had a young child of her own. They also noted the social context, describing the area as having somewhat relaxed sexual mores.
It sounds like the court was trying to take a more holistic view of the case, rather than just focusing on the crime itself.
Exactly. This reflects a broader trend in criminal justice towards considering not just the crime, but also the criminal as an individual. The court was grappling with the question of when the death penalty is appropriate and when a life sentence might be more suitable.
This brings up the larger issue of capital punishment. How did this case fit into the broader debate about the death penalty in India?
Great question, Michael. This case actually came at a time of shifting attitudes towards the death penalty in India. Prior to 1955, the death penalty was the default sentence for murder in India, unless there were specific reasons to impose a lesser sentence. But in 1955, the law was changed to give judges more discretion in sentencing.
So this case was decided in that new context, where judges had more flexibility.
Yes, and the court in this case took that flexibility seriously. They discussed at length the pros and cons of capital punishment, citing debates and trends from around the world.
What were some of the arguments they considered?
On one side, there's the argument that the death penalty serves as a strong deterrent to serious crimes like murder. Some argue that it's necessary for social defense. On the other hand, there are those who argue for the possibility of reform, even for murderers, and who see the death penalty as inhumane.
It sounds like the court was really wrestling with these big philosophical questions.
Absolutely. They even touched on the idea that civilization is moving away from terrorism to humanism. noting that many countries had already abolished or restricted the use of the death penalty.
Did they come to any firm conclusions about the death penalty in general?
Not exactly. The court took what they called a relativist and humanist approach. They suggested that the appropriateness of the death penalty depends on the specific circumstances of the case and the broader social context.
So how did they apply this thinking to Anamma's case?
They identified several factors that weighed against the death penalty in this case. These included Anamma's youth, her status as a mother, the fact that she had been expelled from her marital home, and the social context of the crime.
Were there any other factors they considered?
Yes. Interestingly, they also took into account the amount of time Anamma had already spent under the sentence of death. The original death sentence was pronounced in December 1971, and the Supreme Court was hearing the case in February 1974. They considered prolonged period of uncertainty as a factor in favor of commuting the sentence to life imprisonment.
That's fascinating. It seems like they were really trying to balance a lot of different considerations.
Exactly. And this balancing act reflects a broader trend in Indian jurisprudence. The court was moving towards a view that life imprisonment should be the norm for murder cases, with the death penalty reserved for exceptional cases.
Did this case set a precedent for future cases in India?
It certainly contributed to the evolving jurisprudence on the death penalty in India. The court's detailed discussion of the factors to consider in sentencing provided guidance for future cases. However, it's important to note that the death penalty still exists in India for certain crimes.
This case touches on so many complex issues: crime, punishment, social context, judicial discretion. It's a lot to unpack.
You're right, Michael, and I think that's what makes this case so interesting and important. It's not just about one woman's crime and punishment, but about how society as a whole approaches issues of justice and punishment.
Absolutely. It also highlights how the law isn't just about rigid rules, but about interpretation and adaptation to changing social norms and understandings.
That's a great point. The law is always evolving, and cases like this play a crucial role in that evolution. They force us to confront difficult questions about justice, mercy, and the purposes of punishment.
It's certainly given us a lot to think about. Before we wrap up, Sarah, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners about this case or its implications?
I think the main takeaway is the importance of considering the full context when making decisions about punishment, especially when it comes to something as serious as the death penalty. This case shows how the law can and should take into account not just the crime itself, but the circumstances of the criminal and the broader social context.
That's a great summary, Sarah, and I think it's a reminder of how complex and nuanced these legal issues can be. It's not always as simple as crime and punishment. There are many factors to consider.
Absolutely, Michael, and that's why it's so important for us to continue having these discussions and examining these cases. They help us understand not just the law, but our society and our values.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up today's episode. Thanks to all our listeners for joining us for this fascinating discussion.
Yes. Thank you all for tuning in to the Ask Junior Judgment Podcast. We hope you found today's episode informative and thought-provoking. Until next time, this is Sarah Thompson.
And Michael Chen, signing off.